Lusanne and Anne. Anna, welcome back. And Esther and Bob, welcome back. Great to see everyone. We're gonna start where everyone jumping into Maimonides today. Nice to see all of you. And which will be, I think, interesting because we're gonna struggle with what we can call the Moses exception to Maimonides rationalism, right? So Maimonides creates a fiercely rationalist version of prophecy and theology derived from Aristotle and Plato and medieval Neoplatonism. So he has almost a naturalist view of God and a humanitarian, a human-focused view of prophecy. And Maimonides interprets the entirety of Torah in this way. And yet today we are going to grapple with the fact that Moses presents a challenge, because Moses is the exception to Maimonides' rule. So we'll see what that looks like. So our blessing for learning together is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe. You sanctify us with commandments, and you command us to immerse ourselves in the give and take of learning Torah. Broadly interpreted, of course, Torah is every form of Jewish learning, or for that matter, every form of learning. All right, so we're back to Professor Micah Goodman. And Professor Goodman, we've gone through his chapter on prophecy, including the idea that prophecy is something that everyone has access to, the idea that prophecy is something, basically philosopher plus righteous person plus imagination, that there are all these qualities, that it is potentially doable for almost anyone to become a prophet, according to Maimonides, with this idea that God sort of has a veto at the last minute, that you can do it, except God may say no. Sort of Maimonides throws a bone to the Jewish faith-oriented people who are not willing to follow him down this sort of philosophical rabbit hole. Here, however, we get into the Moses exception. So Moses's prophecy, our description of prophecy applies to all Jewish prophets except Moses. Because of course, up until this point, all prophecy, according to Maimonides, is in the prophet's head. Maimonides goes so far as to say that Abraham's encounter with Isaac during the binding of Isaac is entirely takes place in Abraham's head. It is not a real encounter. So here he says, Moses's prophecy was qualitatively different. And this is a quote of Maimonides: "The proof from the Torah as to Moses's prophecy being qualitatively different from that of all who came before him is constituted by his saying," of course, and this is God saying, "And I appeared to Abraham, but my name, Adonai, I made not known to them." Okay, so here is, in order for Maimonides to make this case, he needs to make a Jewish textual case. And the Jewish textual case for Moses's exceptional prophetic experience is that God did not, the text in Exodus says, God did not reveal the divine name, the tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God, to the earlier patriarchs. So Maimonides is saying this text thus informs us that Moses's apprehension was not like that of the patriarchs, but greater, nor all the more like those who came before. So as for the difference between Moses's prophecy and that of all those who came after, it is stated by way of communicating information in the dictum, and there has not risen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom Adonai knew face to face. So we got these two bracketing quotes to set Moses apart. One quote comes from Exodus. Those who came before didn't know the real name of God, that by which God revealed God's self to Moses, and those who come after would never know God face to face like Moses did. So quote from Exodus, quote from Deuteronomy, set Moses apart. Maimonides has to give us the scriptural basis for this, because otherwise it doesn't come from Judaism, right? Part of what we're dealing with here is Maimonides needs to make a cogent argument based on what happens in Jewish tradition. But Maimonides continues, thus it has been made clear that Moses's apprehension is different from all those who came before him in Israel, which is a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, and in whose midst is Adonai, is God, and all the more so from the apprehension of all those who came in other religious communities. Okay, Moses alone and Moses's connection with God. Here is Professor Goodman expanding on this. Moses was unique, says the Rambam, says Maimonides. In part 2, chapter 35 of the guide, Maimonides declares that the term prophecy applied both to Moses and to other prophets is amphibolous. Now, how it is that we get amphibolous, a complicated English term from Maimonides in Arabic. I don't know, but it's wonderful. It's a wonderful term. So how does Professor Goodman explain it? That is equivocal. An amphibolous word is one, quote, in which two or more essential meanings have, for whatever reason, been joined together and neither predominates. All right, so here is Maimonides saying that when we talk about prophecy with regard to Moses, we are talking about something wholly different, wholly with a WH, than that which is referred to as prophecy with everyone else. Prophecy for Moses is a unique experience. The fact that we use the same word for it doesn't make it equal. Now, this, by the way, is a pretty major radical claim for a Jewish scholar. So Maimonides is using the same tools of Jewish tradition and Jewish scholarship and interpretation to understand what's going on in the Torah as the rabbis before him did. However, here he is making a break. He is saying, with regard to Moses, the word that we normally use to describe this phenomenon, that is prophecy, is not the same. We cannot draw an equivalency. And that's not really the way interpretation in Jewish text works. Generally speaking, interpretation in Jewish text means if the word is here, then it's referring to exactly the same thing here, if it's the same word. And that we have to draw an exception to that interpretive rule is requires sort of uncharacteristic, extreme reasons. So here, however, Professor Goodman is going to explain how Maimonides gets there. Professor Goodman says, with amphibolous words, the similarity between the different meanings is coincidental rather than essential. The prophecy of Moses is of a different order than that of other prophets. His prophecy, and only his, had legislative force, right? No other prophet gets to say, God told me to do this, and therefore we have to do it. Is this only in Hebrew, or can we say an example in English? What do you mean, Bob?
And an example of an amphibolous word.
No, it works in any language. A word that's used one way in one place and another way in another. So English has plenty of these words. I mean, you know, by dawn's early light is different than the light we use to light a fire.
Yes.
right? One is visible light, the other is fire. And nonetheless, the same word is used in both cases, exactly the same word with totally different meanings. So
Why didn't he say that?
He did say that. He just used one word to say it, right? This is the problem with philosophers. Philosophers speak in a shorthand, and the shorthand is a highfalutin vocabulary. It's just like any other field. Engineers have shortcuts in language too, right? It's called jargon. Instead of explaining a full process, we say X, and that's a full process. Same deal. Philosophical jargon poses as English though, and right, which is the same, the same for any other specialized field. So the prophecy of Moses is of a different order than that of other prophets. His prophecy, and only his, had legislative force, right? It's the rule of law. Even the prophetical levels of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did not confer upon them this power, right? At no point do the rules given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, do they record those rules as if those rules count for everyone else? It's Moses's recording of the rule. It's the interesting question is, circumcision, for example, becomes a rule for Abraham and Abraham's household, but it doesn't become, yeah, Anna, definitely, amphibolus. It was a new word for me too when I read this. The rule for circumcision is based on the model of Abraham, but Abraham doesn't transmit the rule, right? By Abraham doing what he heard God say to do in creating circumcision, Abraham obeyed God. But Abraham doesn't transmit that rule in a way that says every Jew after him needs to do it. Moses transmits rules and says, this is what we're doing from now on. And really, it's the—
I'm sorry, Rabbi. Why
Yes.
call it prophecy?
Why
Exactly.
call it prophecy?
Yes.
So the question is, part of our challenge is Hebrew has very few words, right? So the word navi is prophet in Hebrew. And it's the way by which Moses is referred in the quote that Maimonides is using. So we're stuck with the biblical term. In English, how did we end up with the term prophet for navi? That I don't know. I don't know how we end up with, except, because the English evolved and the use of English evolved so much later than our use of Hebrew, right? Hebrew as a biblical text, as a biblical language, ceased being used, except in academic terms, 2,500 years ago, if not more, right? Maimonides wrote in Hebrew, but no one spoke Hebrew. We don't get spoken Hebrew until the late 1800s. Meanwhile, there is no such thing as English 2,500 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, and it's only beginning to be its own language in the time of Chaucer, right? None of us speak Chaucerian English, thank God. It's very difficult for us as English speakers, and even the distance between us and Shakespearean English is pretty great. So that means the evolution of English, by the time prophet gets used in English, we're already talking about the King James Version of the Bible in the 1500s. And so that's a 2,000-year gap since the writing of the 5 books of Moses, which is codified sometime in the 500s BCE, in the 6th century BCE, and the writing of the King James Version of the Bible, where these people are designated as prophets in English, that's over 2,000 years. And there's no crossover between those, right? There's no group of people who are speaking Hebrew and English at the same time in that time period. So it's a good mystery. I'm sure there's an etymological reason why we ended up with prophet, but I don't have that particular section of the OED memorized at the moment. All right. Maimonides distinguishes Moses from, all right, so people followed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of the power of their personalities, not because the people were commanded to do so, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are charismatic leaders and temporal leaders, right? They have, the people are convinced because there's, they see that God is with them because they have good fortune, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob have a regular multiplying effect on their followers because they do well in the world. Moses's only authority for people to follow him is that God is talking to Moses. That's it. Moses doesn't come to the Israelites and say, I've got a kingdom for you. I've got more stuff than Pharaoh does. Follow me. Moses comes to the Israelites and says, follow me because your God, our God says so. Maimonides distinguishes Moses from the other prophets and thereby reinforces Moses's authority. Maimonides' conception allows anyone, at least anyone whose imaginative faculty is not congenitally limited, to train, to prepare, and to reach the level of prophecy. However, if Moses's prophecy could be replicated in anyone, then a subsequent prophet claiming to have attained the same level could abrogate, amend, or supplement Torah law. Therefore, it was important for Maimonides to characterize Moses's prophecy as unique and not reproducible. So, interestingly enough, this actually addresses head-on a question that Steve continues to ask us in this group. He's not here right now, unfortunately, which is, who gets to change Judaism? And Maimonides is making it quite clear that there is no prophetic legislative equivalent to Moses. No one can say, Moses said X, I say Y, therefore, because I'm a prophet like Moses, we now do Y. No one can say, thou shalt not murder no longer applies because I am of equal authority to Moses. Or the land of Israel is no longer important because I'm on the same level as Moses. Maimonides has to have this cornerstone in the authority of Moses because otherwise the entire interpretive structure for Judaism falls apart. I can argue with Maimonides' conclusion about what Moses says because we could argue about the interpretation of it, but I can't argue that what I say replaces what Moses says. I can't substitute my Constitution for the US Constitution, even if I'm a Supreme Court justice. I can only say that my reading of the Constitution is different than those who came before. I can't substitute words. Now, we can talk about the degree to which, because we have the liberty of interpretive license with regard to Judaism, that I can say almost that Judaism supports almost anything I want if I can be sort of convincing enough in an interpretive fashion, right? My interpretation could be so convincing that, for example, I could say, as we now say, that marriage between two men and two women is Jewish. That would be unthinkable in biblical society. Fortunately, because it is unthinkable in biblical society, there's nothing prohibiting it. There's nothing that says that two men or two women can't marry in the Torah. Why is there nothing saying it? Because they had no reason to prohibit it because there's no societal construct for it. So we only prohibit things that we see and don't like. So two people who want to build a family together, that's a Jewish principle. It's even a biblical principle. We want to help them. We have rules forbidding adultery for the sake of preserving the sanctity of a couple that is wed to one another, or a number of people who are wed to one another, because of course the Bible also doesn't prohibit polygamy. By the way, this is another one of those easy arguments against the people who try to poke holes in same-sex marriage by saying, well, if you can marry anybody you fall in love with, then I could marry my dog. No, we're not saying that, because also the Bible doesn't prohibit the marriage between a human and an animal, because it's absurd. It's not the purpose of marriage, right? So saying that, the sky's the limit because we're allowing something that hadn't previously been allowed is not reasonable. A reasonable person wouldn't say that because I am allowed to marry somebody that wasn't allowed 50 years ago means that I'm also allowed to marry my horse. That's not reasonable. Or for that matter, my very intelligent octopus friend. All right. So interpretive license allowed, substituting the words of Moses with other words not allowed. Some contemporary scholars claim that Maimonides' view is a necessary opinion, meaning that in order to preserve the authority of halakha, of Jewish law, it is important that people accept the uniqueness of Moses's prophecy. That's kind of what I just offered. But they argue, Maimonides' real opinion was that the terms he ascribed to other prophets apply equally to Moses. Maybe Moses's prophecy was of a higher order than that of other prophets, but it was all the same sort of prophetic experience. So here is very interesting. We have contemporary scholars today saying, here's what Maimonides said or wrote, but here's what he really thought. What he wrote this because of the legal necessity, right? We have to have Moses's authority be supreme because the entire system of Jewish legal thought falls apart if it's not the case. But that's just what Maimonides is saying for the sake of the legal structure. That in truth, in his heart, he felt that that Moses was a prophet like other prophets with, sort of some, not a distinct encounter altogether, but just a higher level of the same encounter. And it's a very interesting argument because, again, going to the amphibolus question, why would the Torah use a word for Moses that it uses for other people if their experiences were so fundamentally different? And would Maimonides actually put forward such an opinion? But I think we can use a Talmudic term for this. There's a wonderful Talmudic term for when you come to the end of an argument and we can't resolve it. The term is teku, and teku is actually an abbreviation for the phrase Elijah the prophet will decide it. That at the end of time, when Elijah will show up and we'll resolve this. In other words, it's beyond our capacity. We'll let it stand until the end of time, at which point we'll resolve it. It's nice to have that, to think that, in fact, we don't need to come to a conclusion of an argument and we can still like each other, even if we're on different sides. We can just say, hey, teku. It'll work itself out in the long run. In chapter 2 of the guide, Maimonides differentiates between divine law and human law. Somebody asked a question. Miriam is also called a prophet or prophetess, says Amalia, but obviously different. Well, so yes and no, right? Is Miriam different from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? I think Maimonides would say no. Is Miriam different from Moses? Well, yes, but only in the fact that everybody is different from Moses, right? It's not any particular characteristic of Miriam that differentiates her prophetic experience, her experience of the divine from Moses's, any more so than anybody else's. Every other prophet has a subordinate prophetic experience in comparison to Moses. So one of the ways that Maimonides distinguishes between human law and divine law is this, is to look at who gave them. It also remains for you to know if one who lays claim to such guidance is a perfect person to whom a prophetic vision of that guidance has been vouchsafed, or whether they are an individual who lays claim to these dicta, to these rules, having plagiarized them. The way of putting this to the test is to consider the perfection of the individual, carefully to examine their actions and study their way of life. The strongest of the indications that we should pay attention to this guidance is constituted by their renunciation of and contempt for bodily pleasures, for this is the first of the degrees of people of science, and all the more so of the prophets. Okay, this is interesting. Good law, meaning that which is inspired by divine, comes from good people. And how can you tell a person is a good person if they have renunciation and contempt for bodily pleasures? I don't think this is a good rule. I don't think that ascetics in particular necessarily have more divine rules than the rest of us. However, of course, this is one of the characteristics by which Maimonides describes people of sort of higher integrity and value. Let's see what Professor Goodman has to say about that. Since prophecy is an expression of human perfection, one may determine the authenticity of a particular prophetic message by examining the personality of the prophet. This seems reasonable, right? You know, a reasonable person as a prophet might offer, better prophecy. If they are indeed perfect, then it is possible that they have attained genuine prophetic experience. However, the paragraph quoted above is not describing ordinary prophecy. It refers to prophecy that creates a law. Now, we saw earlier that Maimonides attributes this kind of prophecy to Moses alone. Since Maimonides previously stated that anyone who is not Moses and claims to have received a law-giving prophecy is a false prophet, it would appear that this passage undermines the idea of the uniqueness of Moses, because it grants that any prophet may be a source of legislation. Is this a contradiction of the seventh kind? That is an intentional contradiction for the sake of the concealment of esoteric ideas. So, is Maimonides contradicting himself here to say, it is possible for a person who is not Moses to achieve legislative prophetic perfection, but it's just really difficult, right? Is Maimonides giving himself an out? Thus, the earlier stuff about whether or not Moses's type of prophecy could be replicated, and Maimonides saying absolutely not, Moses is totally different, is put there for the traditionalist Jewish audience. And then he throws in this little one that, in fact, if one goes through the route of purification and perfection of every aspect of one's humanity, then maybe there is sort of a legislative prophetic experience in that person's future. It's a very interesting question. And again, think about the care with which Maimonides is writing the Guide for the Perplexed. He is understanding that some of his ideas are so radical that he has to cloak them in apparent contradictions so that people who read them will say, huh? And not question his authenticity, but instead just say maybe he's not being clear. Talk about writing on multiple levels.
I think that Christians can see here a description of Jesus being more pure, unique.
Well, certainly there's in the Pauline depiction of Jesus, yes.
Right. Yeah.
Right. The Pauline editors of Christian texts do their best to elevate Jesus's divinity to an extreme form of almost unreplicatable humanity. Mm-hmm. And one wonders if Maimonides would have made sort of the same kind of claim had he been in a Christian setting. Because he's in a Muslim setting, he might be saying, okay, well, we've got Muhammad, peace be upon him. And it's hard to argue that Muhammad's prophecy wasn't convincing to so many Muslims. Not Jewish prophecy, but nonetheless prophecy of great convincing value. And Muhammad, peace be upon him, was a human prophet. And so maybe we're seeing the opening for Maimonides to have a rationalist, pietistic, prophetic image in the future. And Bob says, Maimonides does this just to confuse you. No, Bob, he's doing it for everybody's sake. He is an equal opportunity confuser. Of course, Professor Goodman continues, that would not be the only contradiction. In part 2, chapter 35 of the guide, part of the introduction to his teaching on prophecy, Maimonides writes that since his doctrine of prophecy does not apply to Moses, he will not mention him in the ensuing chapters. Right? I'm not talking about Moses. Moses is an exception to the rule. And so what does Maimonides say? And I will not relate to Moses's prophecy with a single word in these chapters, neither explicitly nor in hints. Notwithstanding this emphatic declaration, Maimonides does mention Moses again, many times. He even illustrates parts of his theory using the example of Moses's prophecy. For example, he asserts that a sad person cannot have a prophetic experience, citing Moses as proof. Moses was so aggrieved by the sin of the spies that he did not prophesy for another 40 years, right? So here, our state of mind influences or either for the positive or for the negative, our ability to prophesy. And so here's the quote from Maimonides. He says, prophetic revelation did not come to Moses, peace be upon him, after the disastrous incident of the spies until the whole generation of the desert perished, in the way that revelation used to come before, because seeing the enormity of their crime, he suffered greatly because of the matter. This is really interesting. What Maimonides is doing here is he's using the entirety of the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, as a proof text. He's saying that in the wilderness, after the incident with the spies, Moses kind of has a prophetic dry spell. That he's so upset, and it's understandable that he's so upset, that he doesn't continue to have peak prophetic experiences until when? Until Deuteronomy. Until the Israelites stand on the banks of the Jordan River ready to enter the promised land, at which point Moses prophesies again. But again, one of the things that's key in this quote, in the way that revelation used to come before, it doesn't mean Moses is not a prophet in these years. He's just not the type of prophet that he was in Exodus and Leviticus. So again, Maimonides said he's not going to talk about Moses, but he does anyway. And that may just be a lack of a good editor. So Maimonides assumes that Moses wrote all the laws of the Torah. It's not how scholars think today. Well, yes. So, and no. I would think for the sake of halachic reasoning, for the sake of Jewish legal reasoning, Maimonides needs to buy into the idea that all laws, all 613 commandments enumerated in the Torah are from Moses. Even if they are from the times predating Moses, they are written by Moses, right? So Moses is the singular prophetic author of the 5 books of Moses, because otherwise the halachic system breaks down. Right? The Jewish legal reasoning that Maimonides is participating in requires singular authoritative authorship for the entirety of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That doesn't mean to say that were he to talk with us today about archaeological and authorial differences in biblical texts, would Maimonides have a problem with someone saying, hey, look, the 5 books of Moses, yes, may have been inspired by some encounter between Moses and God in pre-Jewish history, but we can trace their writings through the first kingdom of Israel. And we know from an archaeological perspective, we don't get an actual scroll until Ezra preaches from that scroll at the beginning of the Second Temple period. I don't think Maimonides would have a problem with that, because one of the things that we're able to do is we're able to uphold that and also uphold the authority of the text, because it is quite clearly the text from which we derive our scriptural authority for the entire halachic system. However, I don't think Maimonides would have been able to make that argument in the Middle Ages. I can listen to, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, who's my ultra-Orthodox friend, who is a super duper halachic scholar, like a major halachic scholar, who can say the reason why there's space for the oral law is because Moses didn't write down the 5 books of Moses immediately. Moses wrote them down on the banks of the Jordan. And so Moses had been talking about it to everybody and teaching about them to everybody for 40 years, 39 years, from Sinai until entering Israel. And Moses didn't write them down until the end. So the reason oral law, the subsequent law that wasn't written down in the 5 books of Moses, is valid as a way of talking about those books is because it's Genesis. The origin of the oral law is in those 39 years of conversation with Moses about the application of the law. And then Moses had to write down the digest version in the 5 books of Moses. And so that all the oral law that comes afterwards, the Midrash, the Talmud, all of that is the extension of that 39-year conversation that Aaron and the priests and the Israelites are having with Moses about applied Torah as opposed to written Torah, which kind of makes sense, but this is how an ultra-Orthodox scholar admits oral law. So here is how Professor Goodman explains this. The dissonance between Maimonides' professed intention not to mention Moses and what Maimonides actually writes reflects essential tensions in his teaching. Maimonides' theory of prophecy is based on the idea that the imagination of the morally perfect person represents what is in their intellect. This theory does not apply to Moses because Moses's prophecy is supposed not to involve imagination at all, right? Moses has direct conversations with God. There's no imagination required. Nevertheless, Maimonides illustrates the imaginative variety of prophecy precisely through the example of Moses. These contradictions may be added to others that Maimonides' commentators have found in his treatment of Moses's prophecy. Closing the gap between Moses's prophecy and that of others has far-reaching implications, right? And we can use our own imaginative faculties to talk about that last piece, right? If we can, in fact, bridge between what's quintessential about Moses's prophecy and what happens with everybody else, then we get closer to having a roadmap to becoming the type of prophet who could amend what Moses said. To have legislative power like Moses as a prophet and make it available to other people would change Judaism radically. All right, now we get some summary thoughts. If you can believe it, we are almost at the end of this chapter. We might actually have to go on to a new chapter in Micah Goodman's work. The next chapter in his work is, after this one, is Providence. All right, so religion and reason. Even if we emphasize Maimonides' straightforward writing and leave aside radical commentaries and contradictions of the seventh kind, we are left with a highly unusual approach to Moses's prophecy. According to Maimonides, the uniqueness of Moses's prophecy was that Moses connected directly to the cosmic intellect without the intermediation of imagination. This was the greatest cognitive achievement in human history. No one will ever reach such heights again. Now, that's an astounding statement, right? In order for Judaism to work, we have to have this vast statement of the uniqueness of Moses's encounter. The footnote on this is on that piece. This was the greatest cognitive achievement in human history, is in fact footnoted directly to the Guide for the Perplexed, which I have up here just in case, so we can see. It's chapter 154. Let me see if I can find it. I, of course, don't have Professor Goodman's excellent translation. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to find it that easily. But in any event, it's definitely a person's distinction consists in property in which no other creature on earth possesses. So here is this allusion to the divine intellect, but I don't see where the Moses piece comes in. Again, one of the challenges with reading Maimonides and other scholars is that finding which pagination with which chapter and verse they're looking at is not so easy. Okay. Whether we stress the radical or traditional interpretation of his teaching, Maimonides' approach to this issue is a revolutionary departure in the history of Jewish thought. The Torah, in Maimonides' view, is an intellectual achievement. Jewish rationalists prior to Maimonides, such as Sadia Gaon and Bachya ibn Pakuda, so these are scholars who are post-Talmudic, so they're from the after 600, but up till about the 11th century, right, to the thousands, labored to demonstrate the alignment of reason and Torah. Sadia, for example, gave rational proofs for the existence of God, the creation of the world, the existence of divine providence, a system of reward and punishment, and even for the revival of the dead. He sought to rationally prove the content of Jewish faith out of a deep conviction that the truth as conceived by reason must be the same truth that is revealed by the Torah. In his view, reason and Torah are two authentic ways of accessing truth and therefore cannot contradict one another. The task of the religious philosopher then is to harmonize them. So this early medieval effort is an incredibly important effort in Jewish thinking up until that point, which is that there must be, that if reason is supreme and the Torah is supreme, then reason and Torah cannot contradict each other. They must overlap. They must be reconcilable. And so Saadia, who is, again, a student of reason and a student of Judaism, has to come up with some way of harmonizing them both. Maimonides, by contrast, does not try to make reason and Torah compatible. For him, there is no need to harmonize revelation and reason because revelation reveals reason. So instead of trying to make Torah and reason the same, what Maimonides says is that reason is at the heart of the prophetic experience, that what is revealed through revelation is philosophical reason. It's not a reconciling, it's an equivocation. The two are the same. One does not have to reconcile the two intermediaries because between us and truth, because they are really one. According to Saadia Gaon, Torah exists in harmony with reason. According to Maimonides, Torah is the revelation of reason. This is what Maimonides is saying, is that Moses' encounter with the creator of the universe is a download of universal principle primal code into Moses's head, and that the Torah is Moses's presentation of the DNA of the universe. Moses gets the operating system for the world from God. Maimonides recasts our conceptions of prophecy, the prophetic event, and the image of the prophet. He bridges the gap between a perfect, unchanging God and the ideas of revelation and prophecy. Maimonides opens up new perspectives on the Bible and on the law, and in the process, he creates a new image of a hero. With regard to scripture, the Bible, many of the biblical stories could be considered prophetic visions. Maimonides and those who continued his approach erode the image of the Bible as a historical book and treat its stories as parables that express Jewish prophecy. This has important implications for modern readers who are troubled by questions about the historical truth of Scripture, to say the least. This allows us all to engage with Scripture as a metaphorical reading of Jewish encounters with God. Scripture is not meant, by Maimonides' account, to be history. It's meant to be teaching story. And thus its truth is in its teaching, not in its historicity. Meaning, and think about what a great argument this is. Instead of having to argue, well, there's no archaeological evidence for the Exodus, therefore all of the Torah is wrong, right? If one is claiming that the truth value of our text is in its historical value, then someone can argue against it merely by poking holes in its historical value. Such and such didn't happen, therefore your entire text is false. However, by making the stories of the patriarchs and the story of the Exodus about what it teaches us about how to understand things, as opposed to what it teaches us about our history, Maimonides opens it up as a philosophical teaching that is true because it teaches us how to behave well, not that it is true because it tells us what happened. Which is pretty radical. It is, for all intents and purposes, the same thing that Mordecai Kaplan said to found Reconstructionism in the early 20th century. The law. The prophecy that expressed biblical legislation was not a disruption of reason, rather it was reason's perfect expression. The law is the product of intellect. One implication of this view is that all of the commandments may be explained rationally. Now, we talked about this last night, that from Maimonides' perspective, commandments that we don't understand from the outset are just ones that we haven't understood yet. In other words, a commandment that doesn't make sense to us already makes sense in God's view. And we just have to learn more and experience more in order to understand it as a logical, because we don't get God's logic, which is actually a scripturally supported argument. The book of Job says quite clearly, has God saying to Job, you're not going to get this. You will not understand the world from my perspective, because where were you when I created it? You have no way of comprehending what I think, because I am God and you are human. And to think that we had that existing text, you know, the latest writing of the book of Job is around 300 BCE. Could be written earlier, could be written maybe 250. It's a late book, but it's probably written earlier. But it's probably not codified and written down until about 300. So the radical thinking in Judaism that we are going to face mystery and not have it solved, that the religious experience, the communal experience of Judaism is not going to clarify everything for us. We're not going to come away having checked off all of our questions as answered. That's a pretty radical thinking for early antiquity, or late antiquity, as the third and fourth century BCE is, right? The ancient world is not rife with, we're never going to understand what God asks of us ideas. However, the ancient world is, in that time period, still contemplating the ungraspable nature of mystery. Whether we're looking at East Asian thinking at the time, or the early Gnostics, or Hellenic thinking about the golden mean, all of these thoughts open us up to the possibility that the right way, the balanced way, the moderate way is elusive, because finding that balance between the thing that we know is right and applying it is difficult. Because the thing that we know is right now may be right in this moment, but it may not be right in the next minute or the next month or the next year. And there is, in Proverbs, in the book of Job, in Taoist thinking, in Buddhist thinking, and all of these thoughts that come out of this prophetic time period at the same time, a lot of this idea that explaining everything rationally from a human perspective is not really possible. And what's fascinating is, as we have gained more and more knowledge, we think more and more that everything is explainable. right? That scientific method will somehow allow all of us to get everything. But the truth of the matter is, the more science we have, the less any single one of us can understand it all, right? Somebody who's going to explain the universe at a quantum level to me is going to expand my mind, but I can bet that the person who knows, subatomic particles and how they function and how we detect them is not necessarily going to be able to explain to me the intricacies of international law and why countries don't get along right now. Those are two specialized fields that have very little overlap. And thank God, because it means humanity has a lot to learn and a lot to work on. But the idea that we can come to a definite answer is, for all intents and purposes, a marketing ploy, right? That a news network can present pro and con, and you get to choose one. As if two versions of any question that are hard to figure, a question that's hard to figure out, will ever cover it. There's no way that most questions are going to be solved with this version or that version as the only option for our answers. If there's still questions, it's going to be more complicated than that. And the ancients knew that as well as we did. And finally, the hero. Maimonides' God is perfect, pure, and unchanging beyond space and time. In the prophetic process, the only thing that changes is the prophet's consciousness. The prophet is elevated above their physical needs and desires, connects themselves to the cosmic intellect, and reveals metaphysical truths. Because of God's unchanging nature, alteration and initiative are transferred into the human realm. A new kind of religious hero appears, the perfect person whose discoveries constitute revelation. An even more extraordinary expression of how divine perfection expands the human role may be found in Maimonides' teachings about providence, to which we now turn. So here is this really interesting challenge, and it's where we run into, as moderns, some barriers for Maimonides' thinking. Right? Maimonides' thinking about the perfection of the divine is that it's to a certain extent static, and to an extent to which a person can achieve divine intellectual understanding, it is us altering ourselves to the point, improving ourselves to the point where we can begin to comprehend that absolute perfection. However, the universe itself is supremely dynamic. And what's different about Maimonides' understanding of the world of science and ours is Maimonides evaluated the universe as if it were an incredibly complicated clock, where all the parts and pieces followed the same path over and over again. And that for all intents and purposes, God created it as it was, right? That the creation story is 6 days of God describing the clock being put together. But after that, it's finished. That's not the universe that we have today. And update, the really interesting question or conversation, if we wanted to see one, would be Maimonides having a conversation with Einstein about the expanding nature of the universe. Because what would Maimonides make of Hubble's discoveries that sustain the Big Bang Theory, right? Hubble's observations and innovations, and the reason why we have a telescope named after Hubble is because Hubble was able to measure the redshift in the stars around us. So he was able to do spectral analysis of stars and say what was different in their spectra was that they were in fact moving farther away from us, and therefore we see red and blue shift all around us because the universe is in motion. That's a challenge to Maimonides, because Maimonides is looking at a universal perfection that's stationary. Yes, everything is moving, but it's moving in the same eternal path. So if our path is not eternal, if the universe is in motion, if the universe is expanding and that might contract or expand and might never come back together, if there is, does that mean that the divine itself is also dynamic? Is God's ineffable mystery not static, but changing? And what's really interesting is in Maimonides giving voice to the mysterious nature of the divine, the unknowable nature of the divine, Maimonides opened Judaism up to a theology that said that unknowable, ineffable, mysterious nature of the divine makes God closer to us than we might think, not farther than us, farther away, right? We can see God in the small things around us, not just in the large structure that seems so far away. And the immanent presence of God is an idea that comes out of Jewish mysticism and is expressed in Hasidism, and is that idea, I think, Maimonides opens the door to. Because without this idea that the encounter with the divine is so mysterious as to be unexpressible, we don't have an opening to, oh, I've had this profoundly meaningful experience. I am experiencing the divine. I am connecting with the divine, and it's different than my friend's experience. And that's okay, because God is so ineffable, so mysterious, so indescribable that our experiences of God are going to be unique and different for each and every one of us. You know, it would be very interesting for Maimonides to have a conversation with the mystics of Sfat only a couple hundred years later to find out how his ideas opened the door to each of them. Any questions before we end? Now that I've opened the door, now we're going to look at providence in 3 weeks, hopefully. All right, I stumped everybody. Maimonides and Professor Goodman have stunned us into silence. All right, it is a pleasure, all of you, seeing all of you. I look forward to seeing you soon. Lisanne says, just wanting to know that I haven't seen this class on My Jewish Warnings, the Hub, for a while. Yes, turns out, Lisanne, that the My Jewish Warnings, the Hub, decided to stop carrying Open Door Judaism. Without any explanation.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. I don't know if I violated any terms or something, but they would not respond to my email or my phone call.
Their loss.
I think so too. But you know, spread the word to people who are interested. And obviously, I encourage everyone to connect.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a good, healthy, safe, meaningful rest of your week. Take care.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Happy Lag BaOmer. Bye.
Happy Lag BaOmer to come. That's right. Take care.
Bye.